when I was in school, 70 or 80% of the kids who were in my batch, both girls and boys, had a military background. Their parents served in one of the three armed forces. In my class of 70, not even 70 went into the NDA or equivalent. And I think therein, therein hangs the tale which needs be addressed. Having monopolized this for so long, may I now request Anit, and sorry, just one last thing. The format that I intend following with your permission is Anit will make a brief presentation for about 10 or 15 minutes about the book, some ideas that he has. We'll then have Chris share a few of his ideas based on a specific question or two, and then we'll open it for the floor for everyone to participate in not an absent dialogue, but a present dialogue. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll go on the panel stage. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. It's great to be here. To the organizers, this is a fantastic opportunity. To my friends, to my family, I can see my uncles, my in-laws, friends from other places, soon to be friends, hopefully. It's great that you could all come here. Thank you for your patience. So I'll start off with a brief introduction about my book, and I'll then talk about it. But before I go into that, I want to start with a small quip. I think the best takedowns in our lives we get is from our better halves. So I got one from my wife. She said, "Why did you write 330 pages on something that does not exist? If it really is an absent dialogue, then why do I have to read 330 pages to find out that there is nothing?" And I thought, when she told me it was too late to change the title, but I was like, yes, I should have thought of that before. But it also shows that she wasn't paying attention to my work, right? Which was also something that wives do. So I'm going to talk about my book in a very brief stage. So this is the title. I'm going to talk about 4 sections. What is the book about the importance of the book, the argument that I bring, and where are we today, right? And I agree along with the chair with the appointment of the CDS. I think we are at the cusp of a fantastic transformation. Everything unfolding now is we are getting better at each possible stage, but because this is current history, it's very difficult to actually tell if this will play itself out as we would want it to be or not. So I think we should also be a little careful to say that, look, everything happening is ultimately for the good. What is the book about? So I examined the interaction between politicians, bureaucrats, and the military in India. I look at the interaction happening in New Delhi, and where does this come from, right? And since I have 2 small children, I tell a lot of once upon a time stories, right? So I'm going to start off with a once upon a time story of the origins of the book. Of that explains to you, I hope, why you think I wrote this book. Why did it take me 10 to 12 years to actually write the book? So once upon a time, when I was in the army, I used to be pretty frustrated with the way we were performing our duties. Frustrated with how we were doing counterinsurgency operations in Kashmir, frustrated with how we were preparing to deal with our threats. And when I used to complain about this to our senior officers, the usual refrain I used to hear was, "We are fine. The problems that we have in India is because of the civilians and the babus living in New Delhi." This became a constant refrain that I heard for everything within the military. And so I got intrigued into this question of why are there weaknesses in the Indian military? And if you speak to Indian military officers, this is a constant refrain, right? And any officer mess discussions, and if you are a brat who stayed in the forge, you will know that this is a constant source of complaint. That we are such a professional military, why are there weaknesses on the civilian side? Why are not we able to do as best as we can do? So I got intrigued by this question, and once I left the military and I started doing a PhD, I thought I'll investigate this question. And the way I did it was I did a lot of archival work, so I spent years in the Teen Murthy archives and the other archives in UK. But over and beyond that, I interviewed more than 200 former politicians, bureaucrats, officers all over the country. And these were not just one interviews, these were repeated interviews. And these were really educative interviews. So I met former prime ministers, defense ministers, chiefs of army, air force, and the navy. And since they were a lot of interviews, which were not just one, you meet them once, then you go back to them again. So I drove around a lot on the streets of Delhi, Chandigarh, Pune. So if there's a lot of climate change, blame it on me for that, right? The fact that I drove around a lot. But I learned a lot from that, right? And what I did find out was, while there's a kernel of truth about the problems on the civilian side, but actually there are significant problems on the military side also. Right? So it's not just the civilian fault, there are actually considerable weaknesses within the military. And so the book fundamentally argues that this interaction between the politician, the bureaucrat, and the military in India has an adverse impact on the effectiveness of the Indian military. I will say that again. The interaction between the politicians, bureaucrats, and the military has an adverse impact on the effectiveness of the Indian military. Now, this should be a stop the press announcement, right? So I'm basically arguing in this book that we are not that effective a military because of this institutional arrangement that we have in kind of Delhi. I do not look at operational effectiveness. I do not look at tactical effectiveness. I think we have the best junior officers, the best kind of avans in the field. I have no doubt about that. I have seen that firsthand with their bravery and their patriotism. I look at institutional effectiveness. And I think, look, I mean, for a long time we have been bothered about the issue of civilian control, of making sure that the army does not take over power. And this has been a concern for a lot of countries. But I think we should move to step 2 of that, which is, okay, so now we know that if you look at democracy, it has stuck firm roots in India, right? One can not imagine the army taking over power in this country. It's as unimaginable, I argue, that the army would take over power in this country as it is unimaginable in the US or UK. So that's something that we should be really proud of. But now we need to move to step 2, which is enhancing the effectiveness of the Indian military. Okay, next slide. So again, as I said, that's a success of the Indian state that we have had strong civilian control over the armed forces. And that's because of our political leaders, that's because of our institutional steps that we have taken to control the armed forces. Also, let's give credit to the military also. We have had a very professional and apolitical military that has imbibed upon itself that we are not going to be like the Pakistan military. We are going to stay away from politics. So it's a combination of those 3, I argue, that we have had strong civilian control. But now we need to move to other effects, which is effectiveness and efficiency. So why is this book important? If you see the press over the last 10 years, the army has been in the news for right and wrong reasons. I'm sure you're all aware of the OROP controversies. You're all aware of the Chief of Army Staff being on the cover of a magazine under a title, Self Before Kind of Service. You're all aware about the Balakot airstrikes and the day after. You're also aware of the Indian Express story, which alleged that there was some sort of a troop, like movement that's scared of the Indian state. My point is that the army has been in the news for a very long time over the last 10 years. And what it leads up to, change the slide please, is there's a lack of trust between the civilians and the military. And we have seen that in part due to the institutional arrangement that creates a us and them narrative. And as I said, if you look at India's civil-military relations, it has an adverse impact on the effectiveness of the Indian military. So among the things I argue for in the book is we need to transform the Ministry of Defense as well as the services to prepare for the threats that we face today. Next slide. So the argument I make, next slide. If you look at the origins of the Indian institutional arrangement, it was created by like Lord Louis Mountbatten and Ismay. I looked at the Mountbatten papers. I was surprised to see that even though he was the architect of our institutions, he was arguing successively over the years to tell the Indians that, look, I created your organizational setup, but there are weaknesses in it. You need to change your organizational setups. So successively, he wrote to the prime ministers in 58, 62, 63, 65, 69, 76, saying, listen, I am the architect of your higher defense organization. I am the one who told you to change, to actually establish it. I find there are weaknesses in your higher defense organizations. Please amend it, please change it. But those were not listened to, in part because the structure suited all stakeholders. And in part because by that time, in the early years after independence, there was a fear of a coup inside India. Right? So I saw evidence of people in the Congress and close to it expressing apprehension that, look, if we give too much of power to the military, it might take over the country. And let's not dismiss this concern lightly, right? If you look at most other countries, post-colonial states in the world, they have all struggled with civilian control. So if you look at Pakistan, Turkey, Thailand, Indonesia, most post-colonial democracies have struggled with civilian control. So I think in the post-independence era, it was a fair concern, it was a fair thing to be apprehensive of. So we created an institutional structure that focused on civilian control, saying that, look, let's ensure that the army does not take over power. And to look back in time, I think, if I was in that shoe, I would have also perhaps emphasized that. Because we all know of the fate of the countries where the army takes over power. And we don't want to live in that country. Right? We don't want to live in a country where we tell our children what to think and to be careful of expressing your opinions. Because that's what happens in a country that is taken over by the army or an authoritarian state. But among the things that happened was the 62 war, it was a big defeat. Among the stories that emerged from the 62 war was a legacy that blamed civilian meddling for the loss in the 62 war. There's an element of truth to that the civilians actually sort of played politics with the military, but that's not the whole truth. There were significant military weaknesses before the 62 war and during the 62 war that were glossed over. But a narrative emerged that said civilian meddling would create military defeat. This is a self-convenient narrative. But since then, you have the outlines of the absent dialogue, as I argue, which is there's a lack of civilian expertise, in part because of the IAS generalist system. So IAS officers who do not have too much of an experience in one particular department go around departments. Two, there are strong bureaucratic controls, but the institutional arrangement means that the Ministry of Defense and the services have a us and them relationship. And three, there's a fair degree of autonomy within the armed forces. So on matters of training, doctrine, education, force structures, there's a fair degree of autonomy within the military. So the main argument I have is a combination of these three factors have an adverse impact on the 5 variables that are most closely associated with military effectiveness. Which are these 5 variables? Weapons procurement, defense planning, jointness, which is the ability of Army, Air Force, and the Navy to operate together, as well as officer promotion policies and officer education programs. It was surprising for me to learn that since this is the social sciences, this argument does not travel seamlessly. So it's not the hard sciences, right? So that table did not travel seamlessly. So I accept where my argument does not apply. And so as a consequence of this, in India's case, if you look at strategy, there's a lack of civilian involvement in the formulation of strategy, operations plans, doctrines, and force structures. That's one. Two, but the choices and the decisions that we make has consequences down the line. That's why if you look at the Kargil war, the chief of army staff at that point of time basically said, we will fight with what we have. Because the capabilities that you have take a long time to actually kind of fructify. It's not just acquiring capabilities, you have to train people to operate the software well. What can be done? Where are we today? Last slide. Firstly, if you look at the Prime Minister's first term, it was a little underwhelming in terms of his delivery, in terms of defense policies. And I would hold the Prime Minister to account for a speech he made in 2015 where he spoke about, it was a very forward-leaning speech. He spoke about jointness, about creating kind of efficient structures. He spoke about that, but from 2015 until his announcement about the creation of a Chief of Defense Staff last year, not much happened. So the first term was pretty underwhelming. However, with the CDS announcement, I argue we are at the cusp of a transformation. So what they are doing is fantastic. They have created a Chief of Defense Staff, but it needs to go beyond that. You need to think about, and they have also strengthened the NSCS, but they need to go beyond that. You need to think about the National Defense University. You need to reimagine the Ministry of Defense, and you need to also have significant military reforms. Among the things I'm apprehensive of is the Department of Military Affairs, as they have created it, is somewhat unique. I don't know of any other democracy where we have such an institution. And as an academic now, I'm inherently skeptical of new things. It would be nice to see if it is operative anywhere else in the world. Larger, bigger issues. So among the arguments I make is the structural issue of administrative reforms and state capacity in India. So as I go around the country and I talk about, look, IAS generalist system has not served the Indian armed forces, has compromised on the effectiveness of the Indian military, I have audiences who stand up and say, it's not just the effectiveness of the Indian military, it's all aspects of the Indian state that the IAS deals with. It's culture, it's urban transport, it is, so basically to say that, look, the Indian state needs to really think about issues of domain expertise. And we have had this argument from 1967 with the first Administrative Reforms Committee, which spoke about the need for domain expertise. And we have had this argument after the Kargil war, where people actually said, we need a special cadre of trained people to man the MOD.
That's a
That was an
Anit.
attempt on my life.
Yes.
I don't know why. Perhaps, I don't know who engineered it, but I escaped that
It's a
too.
bit of a signal also.
I think it's last minute. But there's a bigger structural problem, right? How do you grow expertise in the affairs of the armed forces? And here's where I came up with the perfect catch-22. We do not declassify any of our papers. Where do our students who are attending school at Jadavpur University, JNU, other such places, where do they actually get to study the armed forces? And here's where I was at IDSA. I spent 2 years there, and I went about trying to make the argument of why we should let the military declassify its papers. We actually do not declassify our papers. So officers in the Indian Armed Forces today are not able to read operation orders of the 1971 war or the IPKF operation. They actually don't really read the primary documents. So I went and I spoke to a senior army officer and I said, why don't you declassify your papers? And he said, we are willing to declassify, but the Ministry of Defense has to give orders. So I go to the Ministry of Defense and I spoke to a senior officer there and I said, why do not you give the orders to declassify? And this guy said, only the classifying agency can declassify. The classifying agency being the military. So I'm like, perfect catch-22, right? And I think it might seem a little funny, but I think it's hurting India. It's doing an injustice to the soldiers who have made the ultimate sacrifice, because ultimately we have to honor them by telling their stories. This is the last 10 chapters of the book. If you see the next slide, thank you so much. I've finished. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anit. If I'd known you were doing this, I wouldn't have read the 330 pages over the last 3 days. But it was a fascinating read, and I think you've given everyone here an insight into what the book is actually all about. And I'd urge everyone here interested in the subject to certainly go out and buy a copy. So, Anit, you mentioned the creation of the CDS, right? And this is where I want to bring Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan in, who's been one of our senior most civil servants. He was Foreign Secretary, he was Deputy Secretary General of the Commonwealth, and he has seen civil service or bureaucracy from close quarters, both in India and overseas. And this is the, and you alluded to it in your introduction as well. So I went through the order creating the Secretary DMA, which was actually issued on the 9th of January, which says, the Secretary DMA will be the permanent chair of the Chiefs of Staff Committee. He will be the head of the IDS. He will be the principal advisor to the Defense Minister on tri-service, meaning the three different services that we have. He will be the advisor to Prime Minister on Nuclear National Command Authority, and it goes on and on and on, listing in fair number of pages. It's about 23 pages, so I won't go into that. But what has not been given to him, now this is really where I'd like Mr. Srinivasan's views. What has not been given to him, and that I think is the crux. He has not been given defense of India. He has not been given defense policy. He has not been given war preparedness. These remain, even as we speak, these remain with the Defense Secretary, who is with no disrespect, who is an IAS Babu, who's probably just come in when the predecessor, Mr. Mitra, retired a few months back. He will mark time for the next 2 or 3 years. It's a transient kind of assignment. And strange though it may sound, there is obviously some struggle for power that's going on over here. The Secretary Defense Production retired 2 days back, and they haven't appointed a new individual. The Secretary Defense has taken additional charge of Secretary Defense Production as well. And to me, this is completely the IAS lobbying to ensure that that turf remains within control. If the army now, because, whether you like it or not, the CDS is really viewed as an army nominee. General Rawat is really, he's come from the defense services. So we've lost one slot to the DMA, and therefore we need to protect our turf on these two. I'd really like for Mr. Srinivasan's views on this.
Good morning, firstly, everybody. It's very good to be here and to see all of you here as well. I have a feeling that I'm here representing the quote-unquote civil authority. And this, to some extent, makes me a kind of whipping boy for this session, because civil service are people that the Indian public love to hate. But I think I've got a few things to say on this subject, and if you forgive me, Manoj, I might range a little more widely than your pointed question. Firstly, I think the author here has touched on a very important subject which deserves to be discussed at some length, and I'm sure it will be. But I think there's a historical background also. I don't think I need to go back to Chanakya for this. But there's always been some tension between civil and military throughout history. It's nothing new. What the author has done is to place it in the Indian current context, which is very valuable. But let's remember that both in the First World War and the Second World War, the civil and military leaders were not really, without being hostile, they were certainly suspicious. And this suspicion has endured right till today. You remember in the First World War, quite rightly, the military leaders were found deficient, and Clemenceau said that war is much too important to be handled by generals. And jumping to the Second World War, we all know what President Truman thought of his generals. And we also know that the military also had their own comeback. I mean, the Prime Minister of Japan, who was himself a general, Tojo, told the civil service to give parties and attend to protocol and leave the real decisions to the military men. So this is something that we've inherited, if you like, in India. India was very unique, as the author himself says. We had an army which had fought in 2 world wars, enormously professional. We had also a very professional civil service. And highly educated, highly sophisticated civil service. So there was bound to be a certain degree of mutual suspicion, particularly as the government had decided from the very early days that the services would be autonomous and the civil services would be generalist. So this is obviously, chalk and cheese. So if you say the civil service is incapable of the sophistication of dealing with military matters in the defense ministry, well, the civil service is also in every other ministry. It's in power, it's in agriculture, it's in industry, it's in commerce.
But those may not be so specialized,
They
Krishnan.
are very specialized when you come to world trade policy, when you come to biotechnology, when you come to climate change, extremely specialized contemporary subjects. So what I'm trying to say is there is a historical background which we're very happy that Mr. Mukherjee has pointed to. Now, in terms of the new developments, I think it's true to say, and I think you'll probably agree, that this government that we have in the Union at the moment is more sympathetic to the military than probably any previous government has been. They brought into the Council of Ministers a very newly retired army chief who had in fact taken the government to the Supreme Court. They have introduced the one rank, one grade pension in a remarkably short time, which all the previous governments had struggled with for decades. And they give an enormous amount of liberty to military men to speak on essentially civil matters. I'm really astounded, though some of our papers have mentioned this recently, I'm astounded that both the present CDS and the Army Chief, they speak about Article 370, they speak about de-radicalization camps in Kashmir, They speak about Balakot being just the tip of the iceberg, and the response next time will be much broader. I mean, this is extraordinary because these are policy matters.
May I just ask you to address one more thing on this?
Sure.
Do you think they are within their rights to address POK? The army chief mentioned if he had clearance, he'd go and take over POK. Do you think it's within his remit to do that?
Absolutely not. And I think I remember the time in the central government when such statements by people in uniform would be very strictly reprimanded by the principal secretary to the Prime Minister and by the National Security Advisor. So I come to the conclusion, therefore, Manoj, important question that you raised, I come to the conclusion that these remarks, which intrude into the policy political sphere, are authorized by the government, who prefer this to come from men in uniform than from the defense minister, let's say, or the NSA. And I assume that this is why they're given such an incredible amount of latitude. Now, if you allow me just to come back to your point, I'm sorry I've taken so long as a prelude.
No, please.
But I just wanted to say that, yes, we do have a CDS. We have a Department of Military Affairs. We have, I think, integrated defense staff. Now, these are considered to be tremendous, far-reaching innovations. But as Mr. Mukherjee has very correctly pointed out, he didn't mention this point, but Mountbatten raised the question of a CDS in 1959. So it's taken us 60 years to get round to this, and it's considered to be a great innovation. Perhaps it is, perhaps it isn't. What we have to do, I think, Manoj and Mr. Mukherjee, I think to wait and see. I think that they may not turn out to be this great innovations. They may, in fact, produce another layer of the absent dialogue, and we've got to be very careful about that.
So, thank you, Mr. Krishnan. We'll make this just one more question between us, which I'll request both Anit and Mr. Krishnan to address, and then we'll open this to the floor. So one of the postulates that you make in your book is that the reason that the defense sector has taken a back seat in the last 70 years of India's free history is the lack of relevance in electoral politics, right? You make this point very, very emphatically that it wasn't relevant to our national conscience, and therefore it wasn't relevant, and things kind of just meandered along the way they were. Everyone was in the state of convenience. The army maintaining its own domain, the politicians, we'll come to the politicians later. However, with Mr. Modi at the helm, he has brought, the first time that he brought the defense services and the Indian army into the forefront was in 2016 with Uri's attack, and the those who are somewhat skeptical feel that he did it at a time when the assembly elections were on the anvil. And then we had, then we have had Pulwama and resulting in Balakot in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and of course the resounding victory in May 19. Do you see a direct relationship between the relevant salience that the army or the defense now has in 1.3 billion Indians or 600 or 700 million voters that didn't exist previously?
That's a great question, Manoj. Thank you so much. Yes, I think you could argue that especially the Uri strikes and how it was played up for the UP assembly elections. I don't believe that they did the strike specially with an eye on the UP assembly elections. I think and I think when you look at Balakot and how that changed the conversation just prior to the national elections, you could fairly argue that the military assumed center stage, and perhaps, as we saw kind of last year in May, you could argue that it was the first national security elections, right? The electorate was galvanized on the issue of Balakot, and is this going against the argument I make? Partly, yes, right? And I think, are we linking nationalism and the military too closely together? Because the BJP has played up this nationalist card, right? To say that, look, have hit back, and we care about the military, and so they are playing this card really closely, and I don't think there's a counter to that. Interestingly enough, even if you look at the Congress election plan, it basically, for the first time I've seen post-independence, it really said we are going to appoint a CDS when we come to power, right? So even the Congress is willing to say we will undertake a little bit of organizational restructuring. So yes, in that way, I would agree that it has assumed a salience that it did not have before. This is both a welcome and a worrying development. It is welcome because if the people get more involved in saying, look, let's fix our military, our defense forces, let's care about their sort of disability, their pay, that will bring a welcome attention to the affairs of the armed forces, which has not got the attention it deserves. It is potentially worrisome because it creates the opportunity for a possible politicization of the armed forces, and it creates a possibility for, say, as we saw, right, there was a instruction from the Election Commission of India to all the political parties saying, please do not feature people wearing armed forces uniform in your election campaign. So I think it needs to be seen or scrutinized closely.
And while on this one specific thing that I'd like you to address, Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan mentioned that he wasn't for the army chief to make the kind of statements that he had, or the CDS for that matter, when he was army chief. What is your take? Are these military matters when you say that we can take over POK, or a stance on 370 for that matter?
So on the POK, I have a slight amount of disagreement. I think he just basically said that the Indian Parliament has a parliamentary, like a resolution that says that POK is a part of India. And he also qualified with saying, if given necessary directions, we are willing to undertake any missions given to us. That's what the army chief should be saying. On the other issues, I think senior military officers should be briefed, and I'm sure they are, that they need not address every question they're asked, that they can diplomatically say on issues that could be potentially controversial, and I think that's an Article 370 statement that they can say, look, that's a political matter and I need not address that.
Okay. So one specific question to you, Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan, because you headed that department. For the longest in the 90s, I wanted to get hold of the Henderson-Brooks report, which was a detailed study into the failure of in the Indian Army in the 1962 war. And even as late as 1992, when I tried as part of an academic project that I was working on to get get hold of it, I was told first that the Army isn't letting you read it. Then I was told, this is to do with your declassification. So the then Defense Secretary was a dear friend of mine, so I went to him. He gave me the necessary approvals. The Army gave me the necessary approvals, and then I was told that it's the Ministry of External Affairs that fears the ruin of India's relationship with some foreign countries based on which it can't be declassified. So are we actually living in some kind of time warp? The US has a policy of declassifying documents after a certain number of years. Why is it that we are still stuck in a time warp?
Well, I think, yes, just to answer that question, I think it's perfectly correct that the Defense Ministry needs to be much more open. In fact, Mr. Mukherjee specifically points this out, that the archive should be much more accessible, and that there should be more security studies in various universities. I entirely endorse that view. And you'll be surprised to hear, by the way, a friend of mine is at this moment researching the 1962 war, and he says, apart from the Henderson Books report, that there are many other documents also which are not available to the general public, which is really astonishing. We've got different wars now, different decades, different strategies, different policies, and then we still keep these reports under lock and key. Quite remarkable. I think that there's nothing much more to say on this, except that I wrote that resolution, in fact, which was passed by both the houses on Kashmir. It was standard government policy. I mean, this is what the government of India's policy is on Kashmir. It deals with Kashmir as a complete entity, and not just with the part that now is on our side of the line of control. So I think that it's not sacrosanct. One parliamentary resolution can be replaced by another, and in any case, you remember that the parliament also has a resolution that, quote unquote, not an inch of land, etc., etc. Well, what are we talking to China about in that case? So let's withdraw a little bit from that. And I think, lastly, if I may, Manoj, on the last election, I don't think it's debatable that the military operations against Pakistan had nothing to do with the election results. I think they had everything to do with the election results. I'm not saying that it was a sponsored operation. I'm saying that the mood of the country was such that this government would represent us in terms of protecting our security. And this is a very fine line to project, which rather dwarfs all the other lines about Rafale, etc., etc. It all went into a cocked hat. In other words, the government was controlling the media. And that's perfectly understandable. Every government tries to do this. But I don't think it's at all debatable that those operations affected the election results.
Thank you. I see the next session participants already here and giving me glares that aren't entirely friendly. So we'll, but they need appreciate that we got off to a late start, and I think we have the audience very keen on asking some questions. Anyone from the audience that wishes to ask? Otherwise, I have plenty to ask the authors. So, anyone from the audience? Yes, please.
Very interesting session, but I just want to broaden it up a little bit. A little bit of discussion has happened on the defense force, civil forces, but I just want it to be, my question is about defense forces and civilians. I want to ask your opinion on why civilians are not talking about.
That's a fantastic question. Look, I think to a certain extent, this distance would always be there in any country. Any soldier would feel he or she has not been given the due deference. You have seen that from the time of ancient Rome, where people used to defend and fight for the glory of Rome across ancient Carthage and say, oh, when we go back to Rome, they did. So there's an element of that, but I think in India's case, it's also amplified by the fact that at least the military is not willing to engage with civilians in a way that is healthy and is open to a dialogue. So I think there are too many cantonments, there are too many secrecy laws, right? I mean, look at Fort William. Fort William has a fantastic museum. How many people would have the access to actually drive into Fort William and say, I want to show it to my children because, because there'll be kind of security concern, you have to take clearances. And it goes back to the declassification issue. If you do not let the civilian students in India at Jadavpur, at JNU, at smaller towns learn about the armed forces, then you cannot just stand on and say, oh, they don't care about us, because they don't know about you, because you're not letting them know about you. And the version that you are allowing to be told about yourself is this version where you're the best in the world. Now, you are pretty good, but I think you can be honest enough to say some things we did right, some things we didn't do right. We are and that's what professional organizations do, right? They acknowledge where they messed up and they kind of learn from it. Among the biggest problems I have is we still are not focusing enough on military history within the institutions, within the armed forces themselves. And that's why I like go around army institutions saying, can any colonel stand up and describe to me the movement of forces during Operation Parakram? Where did different formations move? Because then we should learn from it, right? We are talking about Gold Star. There's you can hear crickets, right? Utter silence. And that's why I think it's important for us to open up.
Thanks, Anit. So, I can see Raghavendra Singh, my dear friend, really, really giving me the glares. But Raghu, we started a tad late, so just a few minutes for wrap up. You mentioned, Anit, and this is one area I think you kind of didn't really delve into your book, maybe because you were wanted to be politically correct or you didn't want to get into controversy. And you mentioned that the politician has really left the army or the defense forces alone for a slew of reasons. I will respectfully disagree with you entirely. The politician in India has only left the defense forces alone to the extent that it has suited him to leave it alone. Whenever he has needed to make money from the system, whether it's Bofors or Augusta Westland or any other, regrettably, the army has not only towed the line. When I say army, I'm including the tri-services. It has not only towed the line, they have also altered specs to suit the vagaries or needs of the relevant politician at that point in time. And therefore, I think the army has been complicit in the failure of the Indian defense services not being ready to face a war. When you talk about effective war, etc., we are just not battle ready, and some of the problem also lies within the army. I think you need to acknowledge that, which has been missed in your book, I'm sorry to say.
Thanks so much, Manoj. Actually, I do talk about the Jeep scandal in the 50s with Krishna Menon. I do talk about the Jaguar case in the 70s with Jagjeevan Ram. And I do acknowledge that, look, the fact that defense deals are used by political parties to enrich their own coffers actually should open up a larger conversation about electoral campaign finance in India. Right? How can anyone fight elections when you do not have transparency on this issue? And on this issue, all the political parties are complicit in saying, do not look at our account books. And I think as the people of India, we could blame the military for being complicit and being a part of the defense deals, but actually they'll go ahead with the defense deals immaterial of the army's kind of complicity or not. I think as the people of India, we should ask accountability of all our political parties to say, what's the story about campaign finance? What explains who pays your money, who pays for your elections? Because since we are not asking the kind of these questions, we are dealing with the inefficiencies of that. You have the electoral bond system, which is completely opaque. You have other forms of electoral kind of finance, which creates opportunities for vested business houses and other elements to take advantage. And I think we as a people are suffering for this fundamental structural flaw.
So is the army really not battle ready to the extent that it is made out? Because if I look at what happened in 1962 and our virtual demolition by the Chinese in their Blitzkrieg attack, and then I look at 2012 when we had the Daulat Beg Oldie incident when Salman Khurshid went on his knees to China. And then I look at Doklam, where we stood our ground in a country or land that was not ours, but a country that's a quasi-protectorate in a sense. Does it not show a coming of age of the Indian Defense Services? Were we, and I'll add one more thing, were we not really ready? Would we have had the courage to do what we did in Doklam?
That's a great question. No, we are not as weak as we were in 62. There's been a definite progression. So we are not as weak as we were in 62, so there's been a definite improvement since those weak days. But I also look at Balakot and the day after, right? I think when we look at the amount of defense budget, we should have done better on both those days. When I go outside the country and I talk about a partial hit, and audiences laugh. They're like, well, there's no evidence for that. You claim there's a partial hit. And I think when we look at least both those days, I say this clearly, I think the Indian Air Force lost a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to kind of cover itself with glory.
But Anit, just one point on Balakot. You must also remember that the Indian Air Force chose it because it was furthest from any civilian casualty that may have been possible in the hit. So it was actually a thought-through, sensitive decision for which the Indian Tri-Services need be given credit as well.
Well, that's a different point, right? We're not talking about the targeting of it. I'm talking about the actual conduct of the airstrike and the fact that we don't have irrefutable proof that we actually hit the buildings. So that's one. Two is on the next day with the airstrike, there are enough questions now being asked about Indian Air Force capabilities for beyond visual range capabilities, right? This has been admitted by Air Chief Marshal Dhanwar. And there are questions being asked about why weren't our SUs stationed at Avantipur. These are very important questions that should not be brushed, under the carpet. With those 2 days, as an Indian, I was a little upset. I think we should have done better. But as an author, I felt vindicated, right? Because this is what I'm talking about. Our military effectiveness is compromised, not because of that particular operation, but of events that go back 10 years. Who gave the order not to build hardened air shelters at Avantipur? Why was it not built? Right? Who gave the orders to the Air Force of how much training is authorized to the Indian Air Force pilot to actually carry out live training with those missiles? These are questions that need to be asked so that we do better next time. And I don't think those questions are being asked. Hence absent dialogue.
Well, I really need to wrap up because, I have no choice but to listen to this charming lady, Malvika, who decides whether I'm at an event or not. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for being present in an absent dialogue. I'm delighted that all of you joined us. I'll just wrap with one last thing. Many things that Anit has said in his book, as we know, military intelligence has been keeping track and acted upon it. Some things even before the session commenced today. You talk about the Goldwater-Nichols Act in the US, and I think the crying need in India is for us to have some such act, an Indian equivalent. We did have the Naresh Chandra committee, but I think that just skirted the surface and not beyond. So in that hope, since he raises this point very, very loudly in his book, may I request whosoever is here from military intelligence to take note, convey this to all the three pillars or silos that we speak of, whether it's the bureaucracy, whether it's the defense services, or it's the Indian politician. Please do convey to them that the urge and the need of the hour is to have a Goldwater-Nichols equivalent in India. And towards that, let us raise a toast and a big, big thank you to Anit and Mr. Krishnan Srinivasan for being here with us. Thank you.